One. So welcome everybody. This is Justin, eProfessor, and this week we're going to talk podcasting, one of the, I think, easiest and fastest ways to try to build your environment in this world. Things are going to start changing and shifting. We're going to have different things happen, and we need to be in front of people. And I still think this is one of the best ways to do it is podcasting. I've been saying to do it for 3 years. I'm finally doing it thanks to this gentleman here, Danny. Danny has helped me get off the bench and actually do this. Danny is an amazing person. I met him at a Future Proof mentorship program I joined. Super smart man, knows podcasting, been doing it almost since the inception of podcasts, if not at the inception of podcasting. He's also the founder of Emerald City Productions, and he's worked with major hitters out there that has gotten their podcast up there and running. So welcome, Danny. Anything else you want to add? What I forgot? I'm sure I forgot something.
Thank you, Justin. I know you hit most of it. I've been in audio production since the early 2000s. So yeah, around the time that podcasts actually started.
Yeah. So, here, I guess we'll just start off with the toughest question of all. Why should we be podcasting? Why is this platform? Why do I believe it's so powerful? And why should we be actually doing it?
Well, and we're recording this right around the time of the election. So there's been a lot of talk about how it's really hard for people to communicate with each other right now, and there's a big split and people can't talk with each other. What I found was that of the media that we have available for actually having conversations and discussing things and learning things, podcasting really was what fit that best for me and for a lot of people. Really what happens is if you're thinking about other forms of media like a blog or video, YouTube, social media, things like that, we're talking little snippets, little bites, you might do a 7-minute video and you're lucky to get two people watching for 2 to 3 minutes. With a podcast, what you experience is that 93% of all podcast listeners, they're listening to more than half or all of a podcast episode. So you get a situation where your listeners, if you have a podcast that's a 30-minute podcast, they're spending 15 minutes with you. They're spending 20 minutes with you. And what happens is that for the podcast listener, they actually start to think of the host of the podcast as a friend. There's a connection that develops there. And that connection leads to trust. That leads to the listener of the podcast treating you as an authority, as an expert. And if you listen to podcasts, you probably know this feeling. It feels like an old friend each week that shows up on the same day and is going to talk with you about some things. So that's why it's really powerful for me, is that you build this deep relationship with your audience, with your listener, with your community, that you just don't get from other forms of content and other forms of media that are out there today.
Well, right. I mean, blogging was where it all started at. I mean, that's actually was the RSS feed that's been manipulated now for podcasting. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest with you, I never took off on blogging because I can speak. Don't make me write, right? Yeah. So don't make me do that. But speaking is okay. And I think one of the things that I've learned from listening to other podcasts is, I think what you said is amazing, is we do build that bond, right? They're in our ear. We're understanding them. We're learning about them. We're doing a whole bunch of stuff that I think is just really fascinating by this. I'd love to see what research says about what kind of relationships are being formed by this implicitly. So with the power of that, we sit there and say, okay, I know I need to do this. I know I need to do this, but I don't know anything, right? I don't know where to start, how to start, when to start, all this stuff. So let's just start off with, how do I start? What are the tools that I need? What are the processes that need to happen in this stuff? So, and again, remember, Danny, I told you early on, this is mostly for real estate. It's all the small businesses, but my biggest audience is real estate. And I'll tell you right now, if you're listening to them, I'll just say what's in their ear. I don't have time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's very similar to a lot of the people that I work with, a lot of lawyers, doctors, other business owners. So it's very, very similar to what I deal with on a daily basis with clients.
Yeah, it's always tough. So where do I start? How do I do, what do I need equipment? Can I start with my phone? Do I have to have a $500,000 microphone? Do I need to
No,
have cameras like we're doing right now?
no. And you're talking to someone who has worked with microphones that cost 5 figures, that are, German technology built in the 50s and 60s. So I know expensive mics. I know inexpensive mics. The one I'm talking to you on is a $100 microphone that is a USB microphone. Before I talk about equipment, I always say, when you start, how do you start? You have to first think about why. And we hear that all over the place. If you listen to any podcast, if you listen to any leadership gurus, if you listen to anything, it always start with why, right? Simon Sinek, I think, is the one who started that in that form, or that actual nomenclature. You really have to know who you want to talk to, because it doesn't matter how great your microphone is. It doesn't matter how much help you have producing your shows. It doesn't matter how great your web developer is that built you this really snazzy website. And it doesn't matter how great the digital marketing person is that's doing the SEO for everything. If you don't know who you're talking to, or you don't know who you want to talk to, the show will never go anywhere anyway. So you really have to have a really great idea of what is, the term niche, industry, vertical, whatever you want to call it. That gets overused sometimes, but it's because it's true. You have to know, if I, for you, for instance, you're talking to a lot of real estate professionals. Well, are you talking to all real estate professionals? Are you talking to investors? Are you talking to agents? Are you talking to certain people in a geographic region? What is your best audience, or who do you want to help the most? The problems that you solve, who do they relate to the most? That's where you have to start, because that affects a lot of things. That affects what you're going to talk about. That affects the content. That affects the SEO for people to be able to find you. Because as much as we talk about on podcasts, hey, please share this with your friends and family and all that sort of stuff, the number one way that people are still finding a podcast is through an old-fashioned web search. Going to Google, if anybody still uses Bing or whatever, or Alta Vista, or whatever you want to use, that's where people start. So you have to be able to be found, and that generally starts with having a clear idea of who you're talking to and who you're helping through the podcast, or who you're communicating to. And then once that happens, it's pretty easy to get started. Like I said, you can start with a $100 USB microphone like this Audio Technica ATR 2100X that I'm using. Please don't buy a Blue Yeti, because can confuse a lot of people. But something like that, Samson makes one. There's all these that are really inexpensive USB microphones that look like this, that are what are called dynamic microphones. They're easy to use. They're easy to use in a lot of rooms. You'll see me right now, I don't even have earbuds in. Justin's got earbuds in. But because of how I have my room set up, there's not any bleed happening from my speakers or echoes or anything like that. So once you start there, for a lot of people, it's as simple as plugging that USB microphone in and turning on QuickTime or GarageBand or downloading Audacity, which are all free for most users of most things, and hitting record. From there, it gets a little more complicated of how to get your podcast out to the world. And I don't know if Justin, if we're going to get the chance to share anything, but I'll certainly have it for you for your show notes. But I have a podcast roadmap that kind of lists hey, here are the 40 steps to getting there. And the first 20 are getting you to the point of actually pressing record. And then there's a few that are actually the recording and making sure the episode is together. And then the last 10 or so are about how do you get it out there? How do you get people to hear it? And that requires things like uploading it to a hosting platform, registering it or adding it to directories. Like we think of, you'll hear names, if you're thinking about podcasts, you'll hear names like Libsyn or Buzzsprout or Podbean or all these really creative names for companies that we have over the last 20 years. They are the hosting platform. They help push, they create the RSS feed and they help push the podcast out into the world. Well, then there are directories that have to receive it, because the directories are usually attached to an app that people use, a podcast player, to listen to a podcast. So for instance, Libsyn is a hosting platform that then pushes out their RSS feed, which Apple's podcast directory receives and then uses to power Apple Podcasts on your iPhone, or Google Podcasts on Android phone uses their directory. So that's that second step of, you've recorded it, you've created what you need, and then you need to send it out. And then after that step, you also have the promotion of it, which gets into the more traditional things that you know of social media and sending out emails to your email list to let people know that it's out, things like that. So when I say where you get started, you got to start with why. And then you think about, okay, then we can talk about the equipment. And I've glossed over steps of, what are your first few episodes about and what should they be about? Really quickly early on, you need to tell people your story. You need to tell them why you're doing this podcast, so that when they listen to you, they get an idea of, is this podcast for them? And then you really need to give value right away. Help people out, answer questions, solve problems that are common for the type of audience that you're talking to really get people invested in your show. And once you've got that sketched out, then you can record. So that's why I say it's a process, just like starting any type of content should be. You really need to have a great idea of who you're talking to, and then you need to have competent equipment that's not going to sound terrible or look terrible, and then you can think about producing those actual episodes.
So one of the questions that popped up for us, and one of the things that you had mentioned, and I'm glad it was a good question to lead in, you mentioned Audacity as a hosting platform, or as a producing
Recording
platform.
tool, yeah.
And then you talked about some hosting platforms, and you named several of them out there.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Audacity, and I know this from talking with you many times. You like Audacity because it's a nice tool, simple tool, and it's free, right? It's one of our favorite words.
Right.
Yeah,
you can use it on a PC. You can use it on Apple products. You can use it wherever.
And so Audacity is always great. There are other tools out there. And again, at the end, we'll talk a little bit, because I'll let Danny talk about his roadmap, because I think that's a great program to get into. That's how I started. But there's other tools out there that can be referenced for that if you wanted to spend a little bit of money, but you don't have to. But with the hosting platform, there are a couple that are free, but I believe you have concerns over them. So which platforms would you lean towards, and which ones would you kind of lean away from? Again, we're not saying do or do not do, but there are reasons why you like some versus the other.
For recording, you said?
For hosting.
For hosting. Yeah. And like I said, to circle back to Audacity, Audacity for a lot of people can also be overkill. It really depends on, are you planning on trying to do this yourself, or do you just need to record something that's usable? So for a lot of people, they don't even need to get to that step. Something like most of the clients that work with us, they'll record in QuickTime, and they'll record they'll record their interviews or their discussions with other hosts using Zoom, and that's sufficient for a lot of people. Hosting platforms, there's a flavor for everybody out there. I tend to prefer using, at least for our clients, we use Libsyn a lot. Libsyn's been around a long time. They're sort of an all-around good platform for people that need a lot of flexibility. mainly because you can throw a bunch of different types of shows, and there are features that will allow you to get what you need. We use it because a lot of our clients are already established enough that they have websites, they have social media schedulers, they have all these things present already, and they need something that will integrate with that, or simply just provide them the ability to publish a podcast and embed something on their site, for instance. There are newer platforms. Some of the ones that I've seen recently, podcast.co, the Fireside. There's a lot of newer platforms where they are doing things like when you create the podcast, it's also building a website. If your sole focus is the podcast, then you can create a website really easily that looks nice and has a lot of the functionality that you would need in terms of, we're publishing the podcast. We can have an about page. We can have a blog as well. We can have all the check the boxes of things. But if you want to start selling something, or you want to start adding more functionality to your website, that's where you hit the wall with some of those types of sites or hosting platforms. You also need to think about what type of following you anticipate your podcast having. So, for instance, some of the hosting platforms will actually charge more money as you have more downloads. That would be a platform like Buzzsprout. You might get some more functionality. It might cost less at the beginning, but as you grow, you'll end up spending more money. And so you have to think about that. It's easy to migrate between hosting platforms, but when you migrate between hosting platforms, a lot of the times your download numbers will reset. So for someone who's thinking about, eventually I want to be advertising or finding advertisers, they're going to want to see download numbers. So you need to have that information handy. So you're thinking about, like, if I change from platform to platform, I have to download all my stats so that I could then show advertiser, hey, I know this new platform shows we only have 2,000 downloads so far, but that's because 3 weeks ago we switched, and here's the 1 million downloads I had before. I've had a couple clients go through that where they switched and then switched again, and they have to cobble together all these things to show people sometimes. But that's really, they're all really reputable. The ones that stay in business, the 6 or 7 that are out there now that are hanging around and doing a good job, have great platforms. They provide different capabilities. Like, for instance, Libsyn has something called Libsyn Pro, which a lot of the major podcasts use because it allows them to do things like dynamic ad insertion, where they can program an ad from ButcherBox that will run on all of their episodes until that ad reaches 20,000 downloads or 20,000 listens. And then once that ad reaches 20,000, it switches over to a different ad and things like that. So there are all sorts of gizmos and things you can do with different platforms. That's why, like, for instance, I'm promoting myself, but it pays to talk to someone who kind of has an idea of how these things work, because you can then make the choice at the beginning that is right for where you want to get to, versus then having to make changes later that can be a pain and can take time and can require you to have to set up redirects and send emails to your subscribers to say, hey, make sure you listen to the show in the next month or two, because we want to make sure that you get ported over as a subscriber to this new platform. Because it's a very it's sort of an old school system, because podcasts and blogs are very similar. They were created in the early 2000s, and they use a system that is very different than, for instance, YouTube or something like that, where they have their own ecosystem set up for subscribers.
So yeah, that's perfect. One of the questions was about pricing. So all these have priced. I do know there are a couple free. One of them sticks out to me is Anchor FM, and it sticks out to me because when I was getting mentored by you in the Future group, is you had concerns with that, and you just want to talk about that briefly, because again, free is great, and I know a lot of us like free, but it always does come at a cost. It always comes at a consequence, and if you're okay with that consequence, great, move forward, but you need to know it.
Yeah, the only question with Anchor, because it is owned by Spotify now, so it does have a lot of it does have a lot of weight behind it in terms of what Spotify may turn that platform into. The only concern with Anchor, and it's something that musicians, of course, complain about with Spotify, is with Spotify they complain, well, the royalties are low, they're not paying enough to the artists that they're using the songs of, they're not paying the publishers enough, things like that. Well, with Anchor, there's gray area in who actually owns the content that is being published on Anchor. So for instance, if you were to all of a sudden become huge and be getting hundreds of thousands or millions of downloads, and you wanted to then move to another platform, there's gray area over whether Anchor would then own your content and not allow you to move to another platform and take your content with you. So it's just one of those things of, if you're just going to promote your business to a local region, getting free publishing or a free hosting platform with Anchor is not such a concern. But we also have to think about a really good plan at Libsyn or Podbean or Fireside, places like that, is $20 a month. And I mean, I know we're going through a pandemic, but for a lot of people, $20 to $40 a month is not a prohibitive cost in terms of doing business if they're talking about the thing that is their main form of content for producing content marketing. So that's why I say, don't get too concerned about Anchor. I also just feel like there are better platforms with more flexibility, so why not just pay a little for those?
Yeah. Again, I'm using Podbean. I know you're using Libsyn. I think they both do excellent stuff. I just used one that I knew I could start with in there to begin with.
Yeah.
So you did mention something else right there, which I think is interesting. And I know it's what goes through a lot of us, because we'll get quote unquote stage fright, right? I told you it was my biggest challenge. I've been saying for 3 years, I need to do this. I get in front of the mic and I went,
but
I don't know what to say. Yeah. So what do we, I know you said one of the things is, you got to talk about your why you're doing this type of thing, your story. But what are some of the other things that will help us get started to what should we talk about? I'll add a couple things at the end from a real estate side of the world that I think will help them. But what are those things that will help them get off the bench and actually doing this to get moving? What things should we be talking about?
Yeah. Well, I already laid out a few, things
Right.
like your story, things like how you got there. I mean, it doesn't have to be a perfect story like you would give in a keynote where you've polished it and you're really trying to entice people. A good authentic version of where you've come from and why you're here and why this podcast, why are you doing this? And then, I gave the examples of like, what are the 3 major problems that you solve for people? What are the 3 most common questions you get when people talk to you? Like if you're an agent, what are people asking you? Whether they've hired you or not. You can start there. And then it's as simple as thinking about like, okay, so what are some other major issues that you need to talk through? What are some changes? What are, I'll take agents or real estate people as an example. Usually you're operating in one local area. So the ability to talk about that local area in terms of what's great about it, what's going on, bringing on local people that you could interview about your area, maybe interesting things. I've had lawyers use that strategy effectively as well, where they talk about the area that they live because they know people would be bored to tears by hearing the latest in legal things happening in that area or in personal injury or in real estate law or whatever. Or like with real estate agents, hey, here's, the latest 50 things we've had change in codes or laws or new paper. Like, we just refinanced our house. So like, even from a year and a half ago when I bought the house, that's how good the rates are. You guys know that right now. That like they were like, oh, here's this new paper and here's this new thing. I wouldn't want to listen to a podcast about that, but I would love a podcast about this area that I live in Florida, which is relatively new. 20 years ago, it was orange groves. So it's just growing up. There's new schools every year. What's going on here? What are the events going on? What, like the real estate lawyer, the personal injury lawyer that I've worked with in the past, he interviewed like the high school principal and things like that, just to hear about what's going on in the world. We've all been really focused on COVID for 8 months now, but like people want to know what's going on, because at some point we're going to get to leave our houses and do more things. So you can think about stuff like that. You can think about, I always like to tell people really early on, start asking your listeners to send in questions. And it doesn't have to just be listeners. Like if you've already got a social media presence, or you've got some other presence, you've got a meetup group or whatever. I work with a real estate investor who started a meetup group for other real estate investors in his town, partly to get leads, but also just to help and talk with each other. But things like that, you can submit to that group and say, hey, what questions do you have? If you could spend 15 minutes with me, what would you ask? And that can give you 3 or 4 episodes. But then it's really good, once you think about delivering, is sketch out, okay, here's some talking points. Here's the outline of the episode, so that you're not reading a script, especially if you're good at talking. Just having those reminders of, I want to cover this and go through this part of the episode and then move on to this, that can be really helpful for a lot of people. And you just have to remember too, I mean, you're broadcasting this, but you don't necessarily have to broadcast the recording of your podcast. You can just do it and stop for 10 seconds and think about what you want to say next, and then go back in and cut that 10 seconds of silence. Or hire an editor to do that, or a production company or whatever. It's really easy to do. Whereas like if you think about a YouTube channel, there's a lot more editing that goes into that. Like if you make a cut, it's pretty obvious because people can see it. When you're editing audio, I can cut in the middle of a word and stitch the second half of that word to it and do a little fade, and it sounds almost like you said that word. There's even, creepy AI tools now that we use to edit, where I can go through and I can say, identify all the ums, and I can remove all the ums. And then they also are like, if I want to create audio for to narrate a video, I can type out that audio, and they have AI voices that now sound almost real, where it can sound like I hired a voiceover person to do it. I mean, if you know the difference, you can hear it. But for most people, they'd say, wow, that's amazing. So with a podcast, it's so much more flexible in the ability to edit and move things around. So you don't have to worry too much about getting tripped up, because you can just re-say the sentence. If you stumble, if you sound like you don't know what you were saying, you can just stop and say, I want to say that again, and re-say it, and then cut the stuff that you don't want to keep.
I think that's perfect. I would say the other things to think about, and just trust yourself. Be a note taker, right? If you're doing this stuff, we get questions every day. You get questions every day. I know real estate agents get questions every day. You just got to be instinctive to take those notes down, because if you answer that question for a client, someone else has that question. You can answer that. As Danny said, I would say, know your area. I think one of the best things you could do right now is just go interview local restaurateurs, right? Especially for us. I'm in Illinois. Illinois has been locked back down again. So go talk to them. Say, how do you want people to come and get food from you, right? It'd be just simple conversations like that. Local events. What's going on during the holidays? What's open? What's not open during COVID? There are so many topics that Danny was talking about that we could do. You could cover a year's worth of topics in about 2 weeks span of time right now. There's just so much information out there, and just don't be hesitant. Just a question just popped up, which is what I was going to lead to anyways. How long should these be? How, is there, we always hear that we have an attention span of a gnat. I don't think that's actually an accurate statement, but it is what we get told. So how long should we have these? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 20 minutes? Is it an hour?
I would say it really depends. I had a call earlier with my accountant, and they like to use that question a lot, or that answer a lot. If you can be entertaining and keep people interested in what you're going to say for an hour and a half, it can be an hour and a half. If you can only do 10 minutes, great. Now, if you're only doing your podcast once a week, 10 minutes might not be enough to keep people, because they'll listen to the 10 minutes, and like most average podcast listeners, they're subscribing to 6 or 7 other shows. They're listening to an hour to an hour and a half of audio a day, even not commuting for a lot of people right now. They're listening to a lot of stuff. So if they listen to your 10 minutes, they've then got other stuff to get into. And if they get into it and they go on for a few weeks listening to other things, they're going to forget about you. So if you're doing a weekly show, you probably need it to be 30 minutes on average, 20 to 30 to 40 minutes. The average podcast right now in the top 200 episodes on Apple Podcasts is usually around 45 minutes. So like, that's why I say it's a longer form type of content where people can really spend time with you and trust you and feel like they know you. So yeah, 30 minutes is a good one for a weekly show. If you're going to only have the time to do, let's say, a couple episodes a month, you're going to want it to be a little longer. Try to go a little longer, or again, just like the 10-minute thing, you're going to lose people just because they don't have enough content to keep them. But then I'll circle back to that idea of, I've only got the time to do it twice a month, or I've only got the time to do it once a month. Well, that's probably not going to be enough for most podcast listeners nowadays. They want consistency, so they want it to be there when they expect it to be there. So once you decide I'm going to publish these on Tuesday, you need to publish every Tuesday or every other Tuesday, whatever you promise people. Because again, if you don't show up, they will listen to the next thing in their queue, and then they'll get enamored with something else or obsessed with something else and go on that other path. Or they'll find another show that similar to yours that shows up every week. So that's why I say you got to think about, it's not just about length. It's about, can I do this every week? Because people count on it. I mean, there are people that spend more time listening to podcasts than they do with their friends or their partner, their spouse. So you're really important in their lives when you become a podcast host and you get people listening to you consistently. So you have to think about that.
And, I think you nailed a real good point. And one of the things I want to make sure our audience hears on this is we're prospecting, right? So when we're doing this, we're trying to be people's ears so they come back to us for something. And we can always talk about lead generation here a little bit, but I want everybody to understand one thing. We're taught every day that at least 1, 2, 3 hours every morning or whatever time we should be doing something, making phone calls, writing notes, doing this. This is just one of those things, right? You could spend an hour of your day doing this, and now you have it out there. What's your opinion about bulking, right? So if they say, I don't have time, I could do 2 hours on Monday, I can't do anything else throughout the week. Is it okay to bulk it out? Can I just rip 3-4 episodes off in one time?
Bulking or batching or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, there are arguments for that. I would say a third of our clients, we're producing 30 podcasts a week. About a third of our podcasts will batch record. So they plan 2 days a month where they try to record 3 to 4 episodes each day. They'll block out a half of that day or something like that. and maybe one of those days is for interviews where they try to schedule all the interviews for that one day, and they get a month or two. Some clients I have 3 months ahead, and they do that, and that's great. And that helps them. And for some people, that's the only way they're going to be able to do it. What you have to remember, though, is that's great for getting ahead and being prepared. But if something happens, like a pandemic hits, you may have to change things. You can't keep going necessarily with what you had planned because it might come across as tone deaf. So that's why I say it's great to batch. It's great to keep going, but then you have to be flexible enough to realize, oh no, I've got this scheduled for next week. I need to redo it or add an episode in and move this one till later. The last few weeks, I had several clients that did, okay, if Trump wins, this is the podcast that goes out. If Biden wins, this is the episode that goes out, because
Sure.
they talk about and help people that are affected by those things. So, a couple of those episodes, we had to decide which ones to use. We also had to push, some of them a week because their episodes publish on Wednesday, and we didn't have a clear idea on Wednesday morning of who had won. So it went out this Wednesday because now we know. So things like that, where you've just got to be flexible enough and be ready. Batching is also a great way to have a few episodes ready for a rainy day. Like, what if something happens and you get behind and you didn't get to record? This interview got canceled or got rescheduled and you don't have something for next week. Okay, well, let's fill in this and do this Q&A episode. Or that's another reason why it's great to have people ask questions, because then you could just hop on real quick and say, hey, today we're just going to answer some questions that we've been collecting, like your email mailbag or whatever you want to call it. These are all ideas that radio shows have used forever. I actually share, and you don't get it with the roadmap, but if you go to the thank you page when you download the roadmap, there's an opportunity to get some other things. I offer like a 20 episode template idea segment PDF, where there's all these sorts of things that, like, if it's a rainy day, if you can't figure out what to talk about, you've done 50 episodes now and you're like, what do I talk about next week? Or what do I circle back to? You can go in and think about, okay, well, what's been happening in the news recently that affects real estate? Let's talk about that for 10 minutes. Just little things like that help you keep moving.
Is one of the questions that popped up kind of leads into this. I think you were talking about it to some degree. Is there a better day of the week to do this?
Not really.
We do it, yeah, I was gonna say it's consistency more than anything, right?
It really depends on your schedule. Like, for a lot of people, what's the day that's going to work? Things like that. Or, I tell people a lot of times, if it's a business podcast, most people are listening to podcasts on weekdays. But since less and less people have been commuting, and that probably will be true going forward in the future, they will be listening at all different times, because people aren't going to stop listening to podcasts. They like it. So you might get them on their Saturday run. You might get them on Sunday evening when they, aren't interested in the NFL, Sunday night game. Things like that. But it's always better, I think, to think about Monday through Thursday. Those are good days of the week to just get it out there. We're at the point now where there's over 1 million podcasts in Apple's directory. So no matter what day you pick, you're going to be competing against something. There's plenty of noise. You're not going to hit that magic day of the week anymore, where like, oh, there's way less podcasts on this day, so I'm going to show up. Well, no, because even if there's less podcasts that day, it's likely that a lot of your subscribers have 5 other shows that they're listening to. And so they've got something queued up that maybe they didn't get to listen to when it came out 2 days ago. So you've got that as well. It's kind of this rolling cycle anyway now.
And yeah, I know you just said a scary number for a lot of folks that might be listening to this. And you said 1 million podcasts. Trust me, that's not an issue. There's an audience for you out there. Especially if you are hyper local in your area, people are going to listen. So and
there's more. Like, every year there's more and more podcasts, and every year there's more and more people listening. And like I said, there's a million podcasts out there. Well, they're not all active. I think there's probably 400,000 active podcasts, but there's podcasts that ended 4 years ago that have 100 episodes in Apple's podcast directory that will potentially show up in search results higher than you. So that's why I say, like, there's always going to be competition, but that's why that's why you have to have your website and your SEO together, because people are going to find you most likely through a Google search. So if your website's in order, like if you're really clear that you're talking about Paducah, Kentucky real estate market, people that are searching for information on Paducah, Kentucky are going to find you versus someone who's talking about real estate in general. Because trust me, there's a bunch of real estate podcasts, but if you can focus on one area, or you can focus on one region, or you can focus on one thing that you do better than a lot of people, then you're in better shape for getting that's why I say, why are you doing the podcast? Getting the people that really want to listen to yours and are going to engage with your podcast.
So let's end on these two things, and I'll let you get off here and not take all your time. I think one of the things that you said that was most powerfully stuck in my head when you were teaching this a couple months ago was the legacy that sticks around. Because you just said there's 1 million, but there's only 400 sitting there. So that means there are still people that could potentially listen to 600 ones and come back and find you, right? And it's discover who you are. So talk a little bit about the importance of that, because I think you mentioned something before when we were listening before that's how they kind of discover you. They'll pick up on the recent, but they're going to come back and listen to your others. And if you can tie that into, because I know what some people are going to think, they're going to say, okay, do I do ads or how do I lead generate? And I always like what you say about that part of it. So
sure. Yeah, the normal podcast listener behavior is generally they will find you at whatever your most recent episode is. That's how most of the podcast apps work. That if they search for Paducah, Kentucky real estate agent, and you show up and you've got 30 episodes, they're going to see episode 30 at the top of their feed, and they will listen to that and they'll be like, oh, this sounds exactly like what I need to hear. If I'm thinking about whatever. So then what they will do is they will immediately go back to episode 1 and they start listening, and they binge listen usually all the way through. So that's why I say, like, when you talk about stuff and you're helping people out or you're sharing information, they're going to hear all of that information if they like your show, because that's how they behave. That's classic in terms of how podcast listeners behave. And if you listen to podcasts, you probably are saying to yourself right now, oh yeah, that's what I do. That's, I've done that with hundreds of episodes of this podcast. So you want to think about it that way. And then what was the other question?
Lead generation ads.
Yeah.
Lead generation ads.
What I would say, if we're talking mainly to real estate professionals and you're talking to people that are looking to get clients, or if they're investors looking to find properties, or people to partner with, or contractors that they can use and build relationships with, the way to do that with a podcast is really to sponsor yourself. So yeah, if you're doing a podcast that's about the local area, like I'm in Winter Garden, Florida, if I wanted to talk about Winter Garden, sure, I could find businesses that I endorse and use and would say, hey, would you be my title sponsor for this month? And I'll read a 30-second ad in the middle of it for $1,000 for 4 episodes, whatever. $2,000. You could do those types of things. But for most people doing a podcast nowadays, they're not going to be immediately getting hundreds of thousands of downloads that allow them to go to an advertising agency and say, hey, I want you to send me advertisers who will pay me $25 per 1,000 downloads, something like that, for this 30-second spot. That's not going to happen for most podcasters. So you think about, okay, how could I make relationships with sponsors that pertain to my show? Or how do I sponsor myself? So is there a free training that I'm doing that could help me get a better relationship with more direct leads? Is there a product that I could sell that could be another form of income for me as someone who's knowledgeable about real estate and could talk about Winter Garden, Florida, and what people need to know, and or whatever. Things like that, in addition to just, bringing on a client that you've worked with that thought you were great, that's been a client for 3 houses now, and ask them about their experience buying real estate and what concerns did they have, and literally just bring them on the show to talk about what it's like to do something, buy something, whatever. Most likely in that process, they're going to talk about how you helped them. They're going to hear about the experience of working with you. And then that is an advertisement in a way, but it's really showing people, like, what is it like to work with me? Wouldn't you like to become a client of mine? And real estate agents and professionals have been great about this for a long time, of like, what are ways to get people in the door? What are ways to get people referred? It's really the same thing with a podcast. You got to think about it that way. A podcast, because you are becoming friends with the listener, is really referral marketing on a grand scale, except you're not having to worry about other people referring them to you. You're referring them to you by just helping them and providing them information. And, you might start out talking to 50 people a week, but pretty quickly that's 100, 200, 1,000 people. If you stick with this consistently for 6 months, a year, you're going to build up a listenership that then allows you to be referring more people than are ever going to get your magnets in the mail or whatever more people might see a billboard, but are more people likely to call somebody that they see on a billboard or a bus bench, or are they going to call the person that they listened to talk about this for 15 minutes and they actually got a sense of who that person is?
Right.
That's the power there of sponsoring yourself through a podcast, not making it smarmy and just only promoting yourself and all that you do every podcast, because then nobody's going to listen. But if you're really delivering the value of, hey, I'm trying to help you out, I'm sharing this, there's a mortgage lender here in Orlando that everybody loves, and he started a show where all he does is talk to community leaders about what they're working on and what they're doing, and how they're helping Orlando and how they're helping things change and grow and all that sort of stuff. And who did I call when I needed to refinance my mortgage? I called him, because I listened to his show about what's going on in Orlando. And I was like, everybody seems to like this guy. Everybody talks about this guy. I'm going to call him. And had a great experience, because I already trusted this person because I saw how much they cared about the local community. So that's how it works. And that's why I say sponsor yourself before you start thinking about getting HelloFresh and ButcherBox and Care of and all the ones that you could try to get from an advertising agency.
I'm glad you did that. And I was hoping I wasn't going to have to set you up too hard on that one, because I do love the fact when you talk about sponsoring yourself, because I think it's huge, right? And those sponsorships can come in so many different ways, as you had mentioned. One of the ones that I will mention in there is, I think one of the best things we can do as real estate professionals is give out not only what's going on in the area, talk to leaders, but know what's going on in the market. And that's a handout, right? It's an easy little build. You can just have that out there. And by the way, if you want this, come here and you'll get that handout. And now you're lead generating. So there are oodles amount of way to leverage your podcast to help you grow your business. And I think the way you ended this, almost the best way we can end this, is I think you'd look at this from a perspective of giving, because if you do give that, people are going to see you in that true light, and they're going to look for you and pursue you, right? So, keep it as genuine as you possibly can. Anything else before I let you plug away? Anything else that I missed that I did not think of asking on here?
No, I really laid it out there. I think, if people are thinking about this, I really urge them to seriously consider that this is a commitment. We've talked about it throughout, that, you're building a relationship with people and people count on you. They want you to be there. They trust you. And when you use those types of terms, you're talking about a friendship relationship. You're talking about, like, how would you feel if a friend let you down or disappeared or ghosted you or whatever? That's what we're talking about here. So if you're thinking about a podcast, be ready to commit, be ready to be consistent, and be ready to serve and give them that value week in and week out. And at times feeling like nobody's listening, because that's how this starts out. I shared one of my clients who's been a client now for a few years. He shared on his podcast a little snippet from a coaching call that he was doing with a client, and they were talking about how to seriously build a business. And he started to talk about his podcast, and he talked about how he has people ask him about, okay, hey, I started my podcast now. How do I sell this product through my podcast, or how do I do this? And he had the response of, like, look, you only have 3 episodes of your podcast. You've got 40 listeners right now. You can't start just pounding them with products and things like that, or asking them to buy things. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to build the relationship first, and then they'll ask him, well, how long was it before you started making money from your podcast? And his answer was really quick. He said, 2 years. I did this for 2 years, building this relationship up, building this body of work that showed people when they came to the podcast, well, this was someone serious. This is someone who cares. This is someone who's shown up every week and given knowledge and allowed people to trust them. That's when it started to blow up for him. And he's now 6 years into his podcast, and it's the number one driver for all of his business, because he spent that time early on. So if it's something that you can do weekly, and to spend time and show up and not worry about, oh, how do I promote this? How do I do this? How do I get money from this? If you've got that luxury to just start to build it, that's when you will seriously see some benefit from your podcast, is getting out there, giving the value without asking for anything in return for a while. And then people really trust you.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And that's perfectly well said, and perfect way to end this. So let me know what, this is your turn to plug away, talk about what you do. And we'll go from there. So, if you, again, the roadmap is out there, I'll put that in the notes, but if you have anything else you want to talk about, this is your time.
The roadmap is a great place to start, because that will kind of show you, hey, what's involved in getting started. By all means, too, you can feel free to reach out to me. That's my personal brand site, DannyOzment.com. But our business is Emerald City Productions. So the website is emeraldcitypro.com. We primarily work with busy professionals who know they need a podcast, because they are in the type of business that relies on people trusting them. And they really, until they had podcasts, they didn't have a way, other than networking, which for a lot of people has now disappeared in terms of in-person networking, or speaking to large crowds, things like that. They didn't have a way to do that without podcasting. So we are there for those busy professionals who essentially without us would not have a podcast, whether that's helping them launch from A to Z, soup to nuts, get everything done, to the monthly support of all our clients generally have to do is record. So they have to do this and then they're done, because what my team and I do is we then take their recordings. So like Justin would send this to me, and we turn that recording into an edited, polished, produced, great sounding podcast that then also has show notes and an email that go out to the email list, and that has a website created for the episode with a player on the website, and social media posts and all the graphics created for this. So it's, I as a busy professional record, and then I'm done. And then all I have to do after that is respond to the Facebook comments or the DMs that people send me, or the email I get from someone asking a question about something I said in this episode, things like that. So that's what we do each week. And you can find out more at emeraldcitypro.com about that.
Awesome. Well, again, Danny, I appreciate it. My goal is always to bring the most relevant people to it, outside of real estate. So I think you helped me look good on today's session, and I really appreciate your time. So thanks for being here.
You're very welcome. Thanks.
Oh, you left.